Welcome to Advances in Allergy and Asthma, a webinar series that helps Allergy and Asthma Network live out our mission to end the needless death and suffering due to asthma, allergy, and related conditions through outreach, education, advocacy, and research. This is presented in partnership with the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. This is Sally Schessler, Director of Education for Allergy and Asthma Network, and I'll be your host today. Today, we're joined by Dr. John Kelso, who will speak to us about a very timely subject, vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. Dr. Kelso received his MD from St. Louis University. He completed a residency in pediatrics at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego and a fellowship in allergy and immunology at Mayo Clinic. He's in practice at Scripps Clinic in San Diego. Dr. Kelso has authored over 100 publications, served on numerous editorial boards, and is an author and section editor at Up to Date. He is a clinical professor of pediatrics and internal medicine at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, and has been recognized as an outstanding clinical educator. Dr. Kelso, thank you so much for being with us today. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to share.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. So by way of disclosure, I have no financial relationships of any kind with anybody who makes anything. So our objectives today about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy sort of falls into two camps. The first part is I hope to have you feel comfortable appropriately vaccinating patients with asthma with vaccines that are of particular importance in patients with asthma, namely influenza, pneumococcal, and pertussis vaccines. And then toward the end of the talk, we'll shift to the vaccine hesitancy part of that and hope that we'll give you some tips on how to approach families with vaccine hesitancy with the goal of vaccination. So in terms of asthma and vaccinations, the CDC has lots of very important resources, but they devote a whole section to what you're seeing here, lung diseases, including asthma and adult vaccination. So there are particular vaccines that are particularly important to patients with asthma. As this gentleman in the picture says, I have asthma, I need to protect my health, so I get vaccinated. And the particular vaccines that we'll discuss today are influenza, pneumococcal, and pertussis as part of the Tdap vaccine. So if we start with influenza, there's lots of nomenclature that we need to kind of catch up on with the influenza vaccine. So we have influenza vaccines that are inactivated, recombinant, and live attenuated. So most of what you would think of as a normal flu shot, an influenza vaccine, are inactivated, and they're termed IIV for inactivated influenza vaccine. One of the vaccines is recombinant. It's not alive, but it's a protein that was generated in cell culture. It's recombinant, and that's termed RIV. And then finally, the intranasal vaccine is live attenuated influenza vaccine and is termed LAIV. More nomenclature about influenza vaccines in terms of trivalent versus quadrivalent. Influenza vaccines used to have 3 strains of influenza in them every year, 2A and 1B. Most influenza vaccines now actually have 4 strains, 2A strains and 2B, so they're quadrivalent. And that number is added to the end. So we can have the inactivated influenza vaccine that is either trivalent or quadrivalent, and it turns out that the intranasal vaccine, the LAIV, is quadrivalent. And then one more twist in terms of nomenclature here has to do with source and dose. So most influenza vaccines are egg-based and don't have any additional modifiers. There's one influenza vaccine that is adjuvanted, meaning they've put in an adjuvant, and so they put a little A in front of it. That's what that A is for. One of the vaccines is generated in cell culture, and so they put this CC in front of it. And one of the vaccines is high dose with this HD designation. So now we know what all the letters and numbers mean. So why is this of particular importance to patients with asthma? Well, it turns out if you have influenza and end up in the hospital with it, you can look at what conditions people have, what underlying conditions do people have that have had them end up in the hospital with their influenza. And you can see that asthma is quite prominent in this regard, so that about a quarter of all patients, children and adults, who end up having influenza that's bad enough that they end up in the hospital are patients who had underlying asthma. So having asthma increases your risk of having influenza bad enough to have to be hospitalized, and therefore the importance of receiving an influenza vaccine to try to prevent that outcome. There's also an issue in patients over age 65, not just those with asthma, but all patients over age 65, where we have a particular interest in trying to get those patients immunized against influenza because they're the ones with the highest hospitalization rates and also the greatest burden of death. So on average every year, over 20,000 influenza-related deaths happen in people over 65 years of age. That's 90% of all influenza deaths. So again, we have a particular interest in vaccinating patients over age 65. So one way to consider vaccination in patients over age 65 is part of the reason that patients over 65 are at increased risk to get influenza is because there's a waning of immunity as we get older. And so one way to get around that somebody figured out was to give high dose influenza vaccine. So a normal influenza vaccine contains about 15 micrograms of hemagglutinin, the viral protein that's in the vaccine. And so the high dose influenza vaccine contains 4 times as much. So it contains 60 micrograms of each of the influenza strains. And these high dose vaccines are approved for people age 65 and older. So that sounds good, but the question is, does that work? And in fact, it does work. So there was a study done of over 30,000 patients over 65 years of age who were either given the high dose influenza vaccine or the standard dose influenza vaccine, and the relative efficacy was about 25%. So what does that mean exactly? Well, that means that about a quarter of all the breakthrough cases, in other words, people who got influenza in spite of being vaccinated, could have been prevented if patients got the high dose vaccine instead of the standard dose vaccine. So the high dose vaccine does prevent more cases of influenza in people over age 65. Another way to approach getting the vaccine to be more immunogenic in people over age 65 is to stick with the standard 15 micrograms, the same amount of influenza protein that's in the regular vaccine, but to put in an adjuvant. An adjuvant is something that stimulates your immune system to generate a more robust immune response. And this adjuvanted vaccine is also approved for patients over age 65. And again, the question is, that sounds good, but does it work? And we have a much smaller study here, but again, it does seem that it works, that it prevents influenza disease more effectively than the standard dose vaccine. Since we have 2 ways to try to beef up the effectiveness of influenza vaccine for older patients, the high dose and the adjuvanted vaccine, there are no head-to-head studies comparing which one of those would be preferable. Importantly, though, even with that data, the CDC says in regard to vaccines for people over age 65 that they can receive any age-appropriate vaccine. So that would mean standard dose, high dose, trivalent, quadrivalent, non-adjuvanted, adjuvanted, recombinant. So any of the vaccines that we just talked about are acceptable options for people over age 65, particularly in the setting of even if you think that the high dose or the adjuvanted vaccine might be more effective, and in fact, we have data that says that, you don't want to miss an immunization opportunity. So if you have the patient in front of you and you don't happen to have one of those vaccines, it's perfectly fine for the patient to get a standard dose vaccine. Then the last of our influenza vaccines is the nasal spray, the live attenuated intranasal vaccine. So influenza vaccine. So it's cold adapted, which means it replicates at 25 degrees, which is in your nose. It's temperature sensitive, so it will not replicate in your lungs where it's warmer. and it's attenuated. So even though it's replicating or dividing and having some activity in your nose, it can't actually produce influenza disease. So why would someone get the intranasal vaccine? Well, there are people who aren't crazy about shots, so you don't have to get a shot. It turns out, though, that it's less effective than the intramuscular vaccine, than the injected vaccine beyond age 50. And for that reason, the intranasal vaccine is approved only for patients between 2 and 49 years of age. It's also not recommended to be given to patients with asthma, which is primarily who we're talking about today. There's been some limited data to suggest that getting the intranasal vaccine might provoke an asthma exacerbation, although that data is really quite shaky. And in fact, subsequent studies have suggested that that may not be the case at all. So stay tuned, because it may be the case that in the future it's possible for patients with asthma to get the intranasal vaccine. So this is just the list of what's available for this year's flu shots. Again, you can see all the things we talked about, standard dose, high dose, et cetera. And just to be aware that this is what's available. And really the only thing you're having to choose is to choose an age-appropriate vaccine. But the importance of getting some influenza vaccine into all patients, particularly in patients with asthma, and particularly in patients over age 65. Now, for a long time, there's been a concern about egg allergy in influenza vaccine. So influenza vaccines, as we said, most of them are literally grown in eggs. And they do, in fact, contain a residual amount of egg protein. The particular egg protein that's measured in there is called ovalbumin. So that seems like that would be a problem. If somebody is allergic to eggs and you inject them with a vaccine that has egg protein in it, that could cause a systemic allergic reaction. The question is, does that actually happen? And the answer turns out to be unequivocally, no, it does not happen. So we now have over 27 studies involving over 4,000 children with proven egg allergy, including a substantial number who had truly anaphylactic reactions to the ingestion of egg, who all got their flu shots and did not have any serious reactions. Similar data with the live attenuated influenza vaccine. So many children with real egg allergy, even those with very serious egg allergy, given the intranasal vaccine, no systemic reactions. So the question is, well, gosh, why not? We're injecting egg allergic patients with something that has egg protein in it. Why are they not having anaphylaxis? And the answer is there's just not enough egg protein in there to cause a reaction, no matter how egg allergic you are. So you probably know that the American Academy of Pediatrics puts out a document every year telling us how to try to prevent and control influenza, including guidance on administration of influenza vaccines. And up until just very recently, there was this very elaborate algorithm that said, well, gosh, if the child has egg allergy, how bad is their egg allergy? And that led you down one arm or the other to decide they should get their flu shot or not, or they should wait afterwards, or they should go see the allergist, et cetera. All of that is gone. The new recommendations now for the past 2 or 3 years summarizes the data that we just went over very unequivocally. There is strong evidence that egg allergic individuals can safely receive influenza vaccine without any additional precautions beyond those recommended for any vaccine. The presence of egg allergy in an individual is not a contraindication to receiving IIV or LAIV. Vaccine recipients with egg allergy are at no greater risk for a systemic allergic reaction than those without egg allergy. So they couldn't have said it any stronger or in any more ways. Which then raises the question, well, gosh, if being allergic to eggs doesn't make you at any increased risk to have a reaction to your influenza vaccine, why do we bother asking people if they're allergic to eggs before we give them a flu shot? And the answer to that is you don't have to. So that same document very specifically says it is not necessary to inquire about egg allergy before the administration of any influenza vaccine, including on screening forms. So we can all stop asking patients if they're allergic to eggs before we give them a flu shot, because even if they are egg allergic, and no matter how serious their egg allergy, that does not increase their risk of having a reaction. Now, the one question we should still ask before influenza or any other vaccine is to ask patients if they've had a reaction to the vaccine itself previously, and some of those patients might require evaluation. All right, we'll move to our next bug here, which is pneumococcus. So pneumococcal disease falls into kind of two camps. We have a little nomenclature here again. So non-invasive pneumococcal disease includes things like otitis media and pneumonia that was non-bacteremic. In other words, the bacteria did not get into your bloodstream. And then the more concerning invasive pneumococcal disease, where we're talking about sepsis, where the pneumococcus bacteria is in your bloodstream, meningitis, or pneumonia that's combined with sepsis. Again, this is an important disease for which we have a vaccine, and again is particularly important for patients over 65 years of age, where the rate of this invasive pneumococcal disease is 10 times higher in people over age 65. Again, we would like to have some way to prevent this, and we do. So the vaccine, the pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine with 23 serotypes or variations of the pneumococcus in it, this is Pneumovax, is very effective. It substantially reduces 50 to 80% effective for the prevention of invasive pneumococcal disease among immunocompetent adults who are older, adults with underlying conditions, including asthma. So we have an effective vaccine to try to prevent this bad disease. Now, again, turns out we have more than one kind of pneumonia shot, right? So we have the one we just talked about, a pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine, 23 valent, 23 variations of the bacteria, the Pneumovax. But there's also the conjugate vaccine, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, that is 13 valent. It has 13 variations of the bacteria in there, and it's abbreviated PCV13 or Prevnar. And so this conjugate business is, it turns out that polysaccharides, our immune system has difficulty responding to polysaccharides. Our immune system responds much better to proteins. And so somebody had the smart idea, well, let's try to fool the immune system. Let's take the polysaccharide and conjugate it or attach it to a protein and see if we can make the vaccine more immunogenic. And sure enough, you can. So the conjugate pneumococcal vaccines contain the polysaccharide that's attached to a protein to make them more immunogenic. Now, part of the reason that this comes up in terms of adults as well as children is that the antibody response that we get to our polysaccharide vaccine. So here we are, somebody turns 65, they get their Pneumovax, they mount an immune response. So this is antibody level after their vaccine. But after a few years, the antibody response starts to trail off. And you think, well, gosh, we'll just give them another one and we'll boost their antibodies again. But it turns out if you give somebody a polysaccharide vaccine a second time around, you don't get that much of a boost afterwards. So somebody thought, well, gosh, we have this problem of older adults getting their pneumococcal vaccine, but having their antibody levels and their immunity wane after a few years. What about that vaccine that we give kids, this conjugate vaccine that has for years been part of the normal childhood vaccination schedule? What if we gave that to adults? One of the great advantages of this vaccination is that when this conjugate vaccine was first introduced, it was PCV7. It just had 7 serotypes in it. But among children less than 5, after the vaccine was introduced, as with most vaccines, there was a dramatic drop-off in the rate of pneumococcal disease. So the vaccine in children is exceedingly effective. But notice something else here. Here's people over 65 years of age. They also had quite a marked drop-off in their rate of pneumococcal disease, even though they weren't getting vaccinated. So by having the children vaccinated and having less pneumococcal disease floating around, the older adults were getting a great benefit from that. So somebody decided again to try giving this conjugated vaccine to adults who had never had any pneumococcal vaccine to see if it was effective. And again, sure enough, it's very effective, up to 75% reduction in invasive pneumococcal disease. But you'll notice this says vaccine type. So you're only getting immunized against the particular serotypes or variations of the pneumococcus that are in the vaccine that you're receiving. So it's very effective, but it's not covering as many types of the pneumococcus as the other vaccine. So that brought us to this. So this was our approach until just recently, where we said, well, when you turn 65 years of age, we'll give you this conjugated vaccine that has the 13 serotypes in it. And a year later, we'll give you the polysaccharide vaccine to cover the additional serotypes and maybe get a boost from this one, since you're getting the conjugated vaccine first. If you're somebody who was already over age 65 and you'd already gotten your polysaccharide vaccine, we'll say, well, that's okay as long as it's been at least a year, we'll give you the conjugated vaccine. We'll just do it in reverse order. And for people who are under age 65, who had already gotten a pneumococcal vaccine, the polysaccharide vaccine, which would include patients with asthma, as we'll talk about, then when they turn 65, they still go through the same routine. They get their conjugated vaccine, wait at least a year, and then get another polysaccharide vaccine. Now, so that's what was recommended, as this is the part of this graph that we saw previously when the earlier version of this conjugate vaccine was introduced. And now we're looking at just among adults over age 65 years of age. So as we said, when the kids were getting vaccinated, their grandparents were enjoying a great benefit from that, having a dramatic reduction in their pneumococcal disease. So then they came out with a 13-valent version of this conjugated vaccine. And again, there was this dramatic reduction among people over 65 who were not yet getting the vaccine themselves, only their grandchildren were getting it. So then they said that what we just discussed, they decided to start giving the conjugated vaccine. But by then, they'd already realized so much benefit from having the kids get vaccinated, it was a little hard to demonstrate that giving the conjugated vaccine to people at age 65 added additional benefit. Which brings us to where we are now. So now the decision about whether to give somebody age 65 the conjugate vaccine before they get their polysaccharide vaccine is something that you're supposed to discuss with your doctor. It's a shared decision-making issue because it's a little hard to prove now that adults getting this routinely will reduce their risk of disease. But certainly, everybody age 65 or older needs to get at least the polysaccharide vaccine. And again, patients younger than that, adults, but younger than age 65 with certain medical conditions also need to get the polysaccharide vaccine, and that includes patients with asthma. So again, why are we so concerned about patients with asthma getting a pneumonia shot before they would otherwise be eligible just based on their age? And once again, it turns out that the risk of this disease, of invasive pneumococcal disease, having asthma increases your likelihood that you will get invasive pneumococcal disease. So more than doubles your risk. Most of that risk is associated with patients who have even more severe asthma, but very definitely having asthma increases your risk of getting invasive pneumococcal disease. And that's the underpinning for the recommendation that adults, even those under age 65 who have asthma, should get the polysaccharide pneumococcal vaccine. And this is just the table from the recommendations about the vaccines that, again, that show that patients with chronic lung disease, which does include asthma, but also any adults who happen to smoke, all of those patients should receive one dose of the polysaccharide vaccine. And then our last bug is pertussis. So this is whooping cough, as you know. So as with many diseases in the pre-vaccine era, there were hundreds of thousands of cases of pertussis in the United States every year until they came up with an effective vaccine. So the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And when that came out, once again, as with all good vaccines, there was a precipitous drop, and the rate of pertussis went to almost nothing. And we enjoyed that for quite a long time until somewhere after 2000. So in the last 10, now 20 years, there was a bump. There was a recurrence. We started seeing pertussis coming back. And somebody noticed that, well, something happened in here, which is that we changed from DTP to DTAP. So this vaccine, the DTP, was also called a whole cell pertussis vaccine. So the pertussis, the whooping cough component that's in this vaccine, involved the whole pertussis bacteria. It was killed, but the whole bacteria was in there. And while it was very effective, it also caused a fair number of side effects. We used to have children who had very high fevers and prolonged crying episodes and something called hypotonic, hyporesponsive episodes, all kind of scary things that would happen, none of which really had any sequelae, but which were quite alarming. And so they came up with an acellular pertussis vaccine, which turns out to not be quite as effective. So there is now pertussis circulating again in the community. And so the approach to that, as we'll talk about in a moment, is to give another vaccine that contains pertussis to adults to try to get rid of this sort of mini epidemic of whooping cough that occurred. So again, we have some nomenclature once again. So DTaP, diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis. This is what's given to kids. TD, which is what you would think of as a regular tetanus shot. So even a regular tetanus shot has always had this D in it, the diphtheria toxoid. And then the new vaccine, or relatively new that we're talking about now, is Tdap. So it's tetanus, diphtheria, and acellular pertussis, this Tdap. So you'll notice the uppercase D or T are vaccines that have more of that antigen in them. So they all have the same amount of tetanus, but the adult version of the vaccines has a lower amount of diphtheria and a lower amount of the pertussis. So the capital letters actually mean something. So the idea of giving Tdap to adults came about because that would maintain the standard of care for tetanus and diphtheria, the two things that were already in the vaccine, and would provide diphtheria prevention. So the real reason for this is whooping cough is annoying in adults, but it can be life-threatening in children. So you remember on our last infectious agent, the children were helping out their grandparents by decreasing their rate of pneumococcal disease, and now the grandparents have a chance to return the favor. So by vaccinating adults, including older adults, against pertussis, we can keep the adults from having pertussis, and in particularly keep the adults from passing the pertussis to infants where it can be life-threatening. Initially, the recommendation was, well, whenever you're due for your next tetanus shot, we'll give you one of these Tdap instead. And part of the reason for that initial recommendation is you'll recall this is a table that tells people what to do in the emergency room if somebody comes in with a wound. You have to decide, am I going to give the patient a tetanus shot or not? And part of that has to do with how dirty the wound is and how long it's been since you've had a tetanus shot, with the idea where you were specifically told that you didn't want to give the tetanus shots too close together because, of course, as we all know, more frequent tetanus shots are not needed and can accentuate side effects. So for a long time, we had this idea that if you got tetanus shots too close together, your arm was going to fall off. But is that really true? Apparently not, because here's a couple of studies. When they first introduced this Tdap vaccine, they looked retrospectively and said, well, people who had their regular tetanus shot either less than 2 years before they got their Tdap or more than 2 years before they got their Tdap, what's their rate of having local reactions to the Tdap? And it turns out the rates are no different. And then they said, well, gosh, let's really push this. Let's give people either a placebo shot or a regular tetanus shot. And then a month later, we'll give them a Tdap and see what sort of reactions we get. And again, there were no higher rates of injection site reactions, whether you had previously gotten a TD or a placebo. So I don't know where we got the idea that getting tetanus shots too close together was going to cause horrible local reactions, but it turns out not to be the case. And because the pertussis epidemic is still happening, that's when they came up with the idea that let's not just wait till the next time you need a tetanus shot. Everybody needs a Tdap, like right now, regardless of the interval since your last tetanus shot. And that includes patients 65 years of age and older. And then as you go forward in time, so everybody should now have had a Tdap vaccine at least once. And now as we go forward in time, sure enough, every 10 years, we're supposed to get some kind of a booster. And as of very recently, now you can either go back to just getting a regular tetanus shot, or you can continue to get Tdap boosters every 10 years going forward. All right, we'll shift gears here in our last part of the talk to now talk about vaccine hesitancy, when your patient is a vaccine refuser. So I think, again, we need to put this in perspective. Vaccines have been one of the most, if not the most, effective public health measure that has ever been taken in the history of humanity. This is a list of horrible diseases that caused great morbidity and mortality over time, most of which have been completely eliminated through vaccines. So vaccines are incredibly effective at preventing diseases that used to harm and kill people. In certain states, you can choose to not vaccinate your children depending on either religious beliefs, and I'll tell you right now that there are no religions that have any problem with vaccines of any kind, but people say they have a religious reason not to get the vaccine. Or in some states, you didn't have to bring in religion to the picture. You could just say, I have a personal belief or a philosophical objection to being vaccinated. And you can see the states here. Most states, you can choose to not vaccinate your children based on religious or philosophical reasons. I'll point out that the two states that have never allowed such exemptions are not the two states you might think right off the bat, but I'm very proud of them. Mississippi and West Virginia have never allowed any kind of exemptions from vaccines, except medical exemptions. They've now been joined by California, New York, and some other states. So why does that matter? Well, in California in 2015, when we removed our exemptions, you could no longer say you were not going to vaccinate your child because of these personal or religious beliefs. There was, in fact, an increase in vaccination rates. You think, well, gosh, this is only 3% or so. But for some diseases like measles, you really need to have these very high vaccination rates to maintain prevention from the disease. But there was also an increase in medical exemptions. So some of the people that were previously seeking personal belief or religious exemptions were now asking for medical exemptions, which might be okay, except that here in San Diego, for example, a third of all the medical exemptions were being written by one doctor. And so many of these were really not appropriate medical exemptions. And so now we have a law that says if you're in a place where the overall vaccination rate is less than 95%, or an individual doctor has written more than 5 of these medical exemptions, the Department of Public Health is going to take a look at those. I'm vaccinated. You're welcome. The CDC has lots of very important information that helps us talk to parents about the importance of vaccines. And the kind of general approach to this is that anytime we're vaccinating, this is kind of focused on parents and children, but this applies really to anybody that you're going to talk to about a vaccine. Assume that the parents will vaccinate. If they have concerns about that or ask about your recommendation, we can give our strong recommendation. We really do believe in the safety and effectiveness of vaccines. And if parents continue to have questions or concerns, we need to listen to those and respond to them appropriately. So in the realm of assuming parents will vaccinate, a lot of this has to do with the approach, and this has actually been studied. This isn't just theory. So instead of saying something like, what do you want to do about shots? Say, your child needs 3 shots today. Or instead of saying, have you thought about the shots your child needs today? Instead, we should say, your child needs DTaP, Hib, and hepatitis B shots today. So we're sort of assuming this is what's going to happen. give our strong recommendations. So if the parents express some sort of concern about this, we can say, I strongly recommend your child get these vaccines today. So we're telling them the truth. The shots are very important to protect them from serious disease. Many of us would be able to say that we had vaccinated our own children. The vast majority of practices would be able to say they've given thousands of vaccines and never seen a serious reaction. And then if parents still have concerns, again, we need to listen to and respond to their questions. And again, the CDC has a lot of information on this, including such things. Parents ask, well, gosh, that seems like a lot of shots all at the same time. Do they really need all of those shots? And in fact, the truth is that there is no danger in getting all of the vaccines all at the same time. And if we delay any of them, we're leaving the child unvaccinated. That's kind of a common theme here. Whatever risk is perceived to getting a vaccine needs to be weighed against the risk of remaining unvaccinated. So it is not benign to be unvaccinated. It leaves children and others susceptible to vaccine preventable diseases, which are real. Parents can ask about side effects. Maybe they know somebody who had a reaction. Again, we can tell them that the diseases themselves can be very dangerous. We're preventing something, and to offer to sit down and go over the data with the patients or the parents about the effectiveness and how really rare any kind of serious reactions are to the vaccines. Got measles? Vaccinate or you will. Parents can ask about autism. Of course, this came up, gosh, now more than 20 years ago. Somebody brought up a concern about MMR vaccine and autism. Many studies, probably $1 billion worth of studies looking at this any way that you possibly can. There is absolutely no connection between MMR or any other vaccine and autism, and we can confidently share that with parents. Again, this is a valuable resource, the CDC website, that not just the questions that we asked about, but parents have questions again about the safety of the vaccines, about side effects, about the schedules, about is it okay if they're breastfeeding, catching up on vaccines, et cetera. So any question that a parent might come up with, you can find answers to, knowledgeable answers on this website. Again, questions about ingredients. How come you have to get several doses of certain vaccines? Wouldn't it be better if they just got the disease rather than the vaccine? All the really quite logical and thoughtful questions that many parents have about these vaccines are things that we can address in a forthright way. Got polio? Me neither. Thanks, vaccines. Now, what if, despite all our best efforts, the parents refuse to vaccinate? So there are going to be some parents who say they don't want to vaccinate their children. And I think it's important for us to continue the conversation. We need to tell parents about the clinical presentations of these diseases that their children are not vaccinated against, so they would recognize them if they saw them. The parents need to understand their responsibility to tell other people that their child is not vaccinated. We can consider having parents sign a vaccine refusal form. So they're doing something against medical advice. This is not to be punitive, but to just make it clear that we have recommended that they get certain vaccines, and we have reviewed the data with them, and that they are choosing to not vaccinate their children. But we don't want to stop there. I think it's important to remember that success comes in many forms. We would love it if all parents accepted all the vaccines right when we recommend them. That would be great, and most do. If they're not on board with that, we can see if they can schedule some of them for another day. And if they won't do that, at least leave the door open for future conversations to at least say, please, let's continue to talk about this at some point in the future. And what you'd like to do in that circumstance is to have at least one tangible action that you can have the parents leave with, such as saying, we're going to go ahead and schedule another appointment so where we can talk about this some more, or the parents agreeing to read information that you've provided to them. If a parent declines vaccines once, it doesn't guarantee they always will. So many parents are hesitant. but with enough convincing and thoughtful discussion over time, may come around and decide that they do want to vaccinate their children. And we need to continue to remind parents about the importance of having their children vaccinated against these diseases. And of course, we have schedules to get children caught up if they fall behind. The resource that I've mostly been considering here has to do with the CDC, as we've mentioned several times. This is their website that has all of that information. Other very useful and important resources include the Institute for Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins, and there's their website, and the Immunization Action Coalition, which again has great information, educational information that addresses many of these issues that and are printed materials that are free to access and available for you to give to parents and patients. The bottom line is vaccines cause adults. So I'll stop before entertaining any questions that may come up with changes you may wish to make in practice. So I hope that through our discussion this afternoon that we could say that one thing you might want to consider doing is to stop asking about egg allergy prior to the administration of influenza vaccines, to administer a single Tdap dose to all adults, regardless of the interval since the last time they had a regular tetanus shot, to have that extra protection for pertussis, to administer a single pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine to all adults 19 to 64, so even those under age 65 who have asthma. So all adults who have asthma need to get this pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine. And then when we're addressing vaccine hesitancy, our kind of general approach to assume that patients will vaccinate their children and give our strong recommendation, but to be prepared to listen to their concerns and answer questions and to leave the door open to future discussions and with the goal that we really do want to vaccinate, because as you've seen, both for the general population and in particular children and adults with asthma, these vaccines are incredibly effective and incredibly important at decreasing the rates of these respiratory diseases in our patients. And with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention and be happy to entertain any questions that may have arisen.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Kelso. And there are quite a few questions that have arisen. So our first one comes from Bruce. And Bruce asks, how does the COVID vaccine affect people with severe asthma?
So that's been very interesting. First, just briefly, the disease itself. We had assumed, since even getting the common cold can cause asthma exacerbations. In fact, viral respiratory infections are at the top of our list of things that cause asthma exacerbations. We were very concerned that COVID would be more common in people with asthma and would cause more severe disease. It turns out that's not true. That's reassuring, but of course, we still want everybody, including patients with asthma, to get a COVID vaccine. And having asthma does not increase your risk of having any sort of adverse reaction to COVID vaccine. So patients with asthma can and should receive their COVID vaccine as soon as it becomes available to them.
Okay, our next question is from Kathleen. She says, I'm highly allergic, especially to mold, any kind of alcohol, artificial sweeteners, any fragrances or strong odors, vinegar, anything fermented, etc. I'm also allergic to latex. I've had bad reactions to medications, but not anaphylaxis. I do carry 2 EpiPens, but have not had to use them. I also have asthma. I'm very worried about a reaction to a vaccine. My reactions can often be delayed from the time of the exposure to the trigger. What should I do?
So I would still encourage you to be up to date on your vaccines, including the vaccines that adults get, influenza vaccine, for example, and also the COVID vaccine. Again, we're weighing the risk of a reaction against the risk of remaining unvaccinated. So the risk of not getting an influenza vaccine or not getting a COVID vaccine, those risks are real and substantial. Those are life-threatening diseases. So that's why the importance of the vaccination. Many of those conditions, so for example, with latex, patients who have an allergic reaction to latex typically do not have reactions to molded rubber products like that might be in vaccine vial stoppers or syringe plungers. And in fact, most of those are actually, they're described as rubber, but they're not actually natural rubber latex. Many of those other substances can cause various kinds of sensitivities and so forth. So concern about that, I think, would best be addressed by a visit to an allergist who can address the individual concerns, but also with the idea that the vaccine can be administered under whatever an appropriate period of observation would be, or perhaps with appropriate pre-treatment to try to prevent any reaction to the vaccine, but still get the vaccine in.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, should you get a second dose of flu vaccine if you got a standard dose?
No. So for patients over age 65 who happen to get the standard dose vaccine, there's no reason to get a second dose of the standard dose or to follow it up with a high dose. So there are those differences. And again, if you had the choice and it was available, if you're over 65, you would probably elect to get the high dose vaccine or the adjuvanted vaccine. But if you happen to have gotten a standard dose vaccine, that's considered sufficient.
Thank you. Our next question, if you get an influenza vaccine, can you get a COVID vaccine concurrently or at any time?
The current recommendation is to have a 2-week window between getting a COVID vaccine and any other vaccine. That's really not based on any sort of concern about getting the two vaccines together, because for virtually every other vaccine we have, carefully done studies have demonstrated that no matter how many vaccines you get together on the same day, the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccines is not altered by that. And that is almost certainly true with the COVID vaccines as well. And the only reason they've even suggested there be a 2-week window on either side is because nobody actually studied that. So all the people in the COVID vaccine trials did not get any other vaccines at the same time. So generally speaking, you should have a 2-week window on either side. But importantly, the CDC also specifically says if you happen to have gotten some other vaccine, either within the 2-week window before or after your COVID vaccine, that will not change the vaccine schedule for either one. So I would not let that keep somebody from not getting a COVID vaccine. So if you happen to have gotten a shingles vaccine last week and your number came up and you can go get a COVID vaccine a week later, my recommendation would be go get your COVID vaccine. Don't miss your chance.
Okay, here's a kind of involved question about COVID-19 vaccine. The question is, if a person contracts COVID between shots, should they go ahead and get the second dose as scheduled if they're no longer having symptoms, or should they wait? And if they wait, how long should they wait? Do they have to start over? Do they need to get the first shot again and then the second one?
So there are patients who test positive for COVID between their COVID vaccines. It's very likely that their COVID disease was actually brewing before they even got the first vaccine, not necessarily that they got the disease after the first shot, although that's also possible. The current thought on that is that for most people who have the disease, it would be unlikely to get it again within 90 days. So you could consider waiting 90 days to get your second shot. But if you've actually recovered, which would be the case for most people, even if they got COVID, they would have had a relatively mild case and feel fine again by the time it's 3 or 4 weeks later when it's time for their second shot. And in that case, it's absolutely fine for them to go ahead and get their second dose on time. And in either case, whether they get the second dose at the 3 to 4 week interval, or if they happen to have waited a little longer to recover from their COVID illness before they get their second dose, they do not need to start the series over.
That's great information. Thank you. Our next question comes from Brad, and he says, I've read various studies on the effects of getting COVID-19 if you have asthma. Could you clear up as to whether having asthma could be dangerous if coming down with COVID-19?
Yeah, so as we discussed, that really was quite a surprise. We absolutely assumed that COVID was going to be really a problem for patients with asthma, either being more likely to get the disease or getting more severe disease. And now, not 100%, but virtually all studies have suggested that that is not the case. Now, that doesn't mean it's protective necessarily. If you have asthma, you can definitely still get COVID, and there are deaths among patients with asthma from COVID. But the rate of getting the disease and the rate of having severe disease that lands you in the hospital or causing death are not overrepresented among patients who have asthma. There's some sort of hand-waving explanations about why that might be. Part of the reason people get bad disease with COVID isn't so much the infection itself, but a particular kind of overzealous immune response to the infection. And people with asthma, their immune system may be wired in a way that sort of keeps that from happening. But that's a lot of hand waving. But at any rate, so I guess it's kind of a mixed message. One is we want people who have asthma to know that the data thus far suggests that that actually does not increase your risk in the way that some other underlying conditions like diabetes and hypertension or even COPD can, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't get the vaccine. And again, getting the vaccine, people with asthma are no more likely to have any sort of adverse reaction to the vaccine, and getting the vaccine against COVID is just as important for patients with asthma as it is for all the rest of us.
Oh, thank you. That's important information for us all to know. Dr. Kelso, how often do we need to get a pneumonia shot? And could you address asthma as well as non-asthma adult patients?
Mm-hmm. So the current recommendation is that for adults who have asthma between ages 19 and 64, that just one time on a single occasion that they should get the pneumococcal polysaccharide 23-valent vaccine, the Pneumovax, just as a single dose. And then when those patients turn 65, then they'll either get a second dose of the polysaccharide vaccine, or if they choose to, as we discussed, could get a dose of the conjugated vaccine followed a year later by another dose of the polysaccharide vaccine.
Okay, thank you. What's the interval for the pneumococcal vaccine to be given when someone is over 65 years? Is it yearly, the same as the flu?
So not to repeat the dose. So even for people over age 65, they will either get a single pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine when they turn age 65, and then that's it, or they can get the conjugate vaccine and wait a year, at least a year, and then get the polysaccharide vaccine. But then again, that would be it. Now, this is being revisited a lot. So it turns out that if you wait longer between polysaccharide vaccines, maybe you will get a more appropriate boost. So there are some circumstances where people would suggest boosters of the pneumococcal vaccine, but the current recommendation for most patients is that they get the vaccine, the polysaccharide, if they're younger than 65, if they have asthma or other conditions as we discussed. And when they turn 65, either get the conjugated vaccine followed by the polysaccharide vaccine or just the polysaccharide vaccine, and then that would be it.
Okay, well, Dr. Kelso, I'm a former school nurse, and this question would have had a lot of relevancy to me as we are looking at the school population. And Donna asks, what do you say to parents that have delayed getting their child's vaccines because of COVID-19? They say the schools are closed, so there's no hurry.
Well, I guess I would remind them that vaccine preventable disease outbreaks, so when we have pertussis outbreaks and measles outbreaks and whatnot, sometimes those have occurred in places where people would be gathering, but often not. I mean, they can occur even in any place that the overall vaccine coverage rate is not at a certain level. And it depends on sort of the contagiousness of the disease. So measles, we kind of focus on, you have to have a very high coverage rate, the percentage of the population who's been immunized against measles, to keep measles, the disease, from coming back. So even in a circumstance where children are not having as many interactions with other children or adults and have less of a chance to get these communicable diseases, it's still important for them to remain up to date on their vaccines. And in fact, that's been a problem because of decreased just kind of general doctor visits. The rate of vaccination across the country for diseases other than COVID has fallen off quite a bit. And we're definitely going to see the repercussions of that. So even though there may be less risk with not being around other kids, my strong recommendation is that parents still make arrangements to have their children get their vaccines and get them on time, and if they've fallen behind, to get caught up.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, and this one's going to come from Jessica, and she asks, do we have any idea how long the COVID vaccine is going to last for people?
That's an excellent question, and I guess the short answer is no. We're getting more and more data as time goes on. There's some fairly recent studies that suggest that it's quite a long time. There's maybe even some suggestion that the vaccine works better than the disease, which is why we recommend that even people who have unequivocally recovered from the disease itself should still get vaccinated. The vaccines that we have thus far are exceedingly effective, very safe, and appear to provide long-lasting immunity. Now, how long-lasting, again, until enough time goes by, we don't know, but they certainly appear to be protective over a period of many months that we've seen at this point. Whether or not boosters will be required in the future, whether or not these COVID variants will require different vaccines are all questions to be answered, but our current vaccines are very effective, and that effectiveness likely persists for a very long time.
Thank you so much. I certainly know I learned a lot today, and I totally appreciate you being with us today, Dr. Kelso. Thanks so much. Please, I'd also like to thank our listeners today. Please join us next month for our February 2021 webinar when Dr. Brian Robertson will present on sleep issues, the effect of allergies, asthma, and related conditions. This webinar will air on Thursday, February 25th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for this webinar on our website at allergyasthmanetwork.org. Look for news in the horizontal navigational bar near the top of the page and scroll to webinars. You can also view our recorded webinars on this page on our website. Visit our website for quality guidelines-based resources on allergy and asthma. Also access important medical information on allergy and asthma from our partners, the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology at allergyandasthmarelief.org. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to having you register to be with us next time on Advances in Allergy and Asthma. This is Sally Schessler for the staff at Allergy and Asthma Network, wishing you a healthy day as we all work to breathe better together.